Grab your rumpled raincoats and light up a stogie. It's time to play Columbo with Greg Koukl. We've got a number of suspects to interrogate today, and one of them is that notorious criminal, Evolution. No, really. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. In Chapter 3, we had an overview of what Greg calls the Columbo tactic. And today in Chapter 4, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to apply it. Greg's an apologist, and that means he likes to tell stories to illustrate his points. And from our perspective as skeptics, that's a good thing because it gives us specific details we can use to work out an effective defense against his approach. So let's dig in. Step 1 of the Columbo tactic is to get the other person to start talking. Quote, "The best way to start is with casual dialogue and general questions, drawing the person out by showing sincere interest in him and his ideas." End quote. As the saying goes, the key to success is sincerity. Once you can fake that, you can do anything. And that's the biggest flaw in Step 1 of Greg's Columbo tactic. You's pretending to be sincere, but you's actually trying to gather evidence you can use against the other person and catch them out. It's unethical and dishonest, but according to Greg, it's Christian evangelism, and maybe that ain't a contradiction. Greg goes on to tell his first story. Quote, "I once had a chat with a young professional named John who was sitting next to me on a flight. When he learned the purpose of my trip, he informed me that he was not a Christian and none of his friends were either. John then added, 'I used to be a Christian, but I'm not one anymore.'" End quote. And Greg goes on to make the point that if he wants to witness to somebody, that kind of information is good to know. As his conversation with John continues, he finds out that John used to be a preacher's kid, but his dad became an atheist, and so did he. So Greg continues to get John to talk about his experiences in the church and all the bad things that happened as a result of his faith. And that's where Greg stops telling the story. He's trying to make a point about gathering information first instead of a point about how to save someone's soul, so he leaves out all the stuff about how he presumably went on to try and use John's own testimony against him. The focus here is exclusively on collecting as much information as possible before you begin to witness. And here's a good lesson for the rest of us. If a self-identified evangelical Christian begins showing quote-unquote sincere curiosity about our experiences related to Christianity, we need to give ourselves a mental Miranda warning. Everything we say can and will be used against us. And there's a couple different strategies that evangelicals is going to try and take. One is to try and take our experiences and use them as grounds for saying that we've been hurt emotionally and therefore we're just rejecting Christianity for irrational, emotional reasons. Or they could say, "Oops, yeah, that was awful, those were clearly not real Christians," and then make it sound like we's judging God unfairly over things that weren't his fault. It was them pesky, non-true Christians. Well, either way, our strategy here should be to emphasize the thoughtful side of our response to our experiences. God is supposed to be able to transform the lives of sinners when they become Christians, but he don't. We hear testimonies about God supposedly setting believers free from sin, but in their everyday interactions, we don't see it. The promises of the gospel and of Christian testimonies don't match our real-world observations. And if Christians tell us, "That ain't on God, that's on us," well, they's essentially admitting that the gospel and the testimonies is all lying about God transforming folks. So we's justified in concluding that what the gospel's telling us ain't true. Anyways, back to Greg and the Columbo tactic. He proposes what he calls the best first question to ask. And that's the question, well, what do you mean by that? And he's right, that's a pretty effective question, especially if you're interrogating someone looking for incriminating evidence. Just keep the suspect talking, and sooner or later, they's bound to slip up. Greg gives several examples of how his readers might apply that question to specific statements. For each question or statement that someone might give him, Greg suggests some questions that believers is supposed to ask in reply. Quote, "Do you believe in evolution?" "What do you mean by evolution?" "There's more than one kind. Which one do you mean?" "What about all the evil in the world?" "What do you mean by evil? What makes bad things bad?" "Do you take the Bible literally?" Well, that depends on what you mean by literally. What specifically were you thinking of? Science has proved there is no God. Really? Precisely how did science do that? Abortion is okay because a fetus is a human but not a person. Really? What's the difference between the two? End quote. So let's take a quick look at each of these topics. If a believer says there's more than one kind of evolution, we can turn the tables here and ask, well, what kinds of evolution are you thinking of? It's true, we use the term evolution to describe things like biological evolution or social evolution or even the evolution of an idea. But if we're talking to someone like Greg, chances are pretty good that he's talking about quote-unquote microevolution versus quote-unquote macroevolution. And of course, there's a whole bunch of scientific discussion that could happen here explaining why macroevolution is just the accumulation of microevolution over time. But I can tell you from personal experience that this ain't going to do diddly squat in terms of challenging the believer's dogmatic beliefs. Instead, I like to point out that the creationist debate over macro versus micro is consistent with God being an imaginary character. You can tell stories about imaginary gods, and you can have those gods do anything you can imagine in those stories. But one thing them gods can't do, even in a story, is anything that you can't imagine or ain't willing to imagine. When primitive folks made up their creation myths, they could imagine God using magic to create all the plants and animals and such, but one thing they couldn't imagine is God creating a biological system as elegant and sophisticated as evolution. They simply didn't know enough about biology and biochemistry and genetics and stuff. If God was real, he'd be able to design an ingenious system that primitive folks couldn't even begin to understand, and creationists wouldn't have any way to know how complicated it all really was. But here's the thing. Creationists do know, beyond all conceivable doubt, that God didn't do that. Imaginary gods is only capable of doing what believers is willing and able to imagine, and creationists is unwilling to imagine God creating macroevolution, so he can't do it on account of he's limited by their imaginations. And the fact that they know he didn't do it is evidence that he's an imaginary God limited by their imaginations. Now, I guarantee you, if you says that to a creationist, that's going to make them sit back and think about some things they don't necessarily want to think about. Next question, what do you mean by evil? Well, my answer is that for the sake of argument, I'll define evil as whatever God designates as evil. The point is that a perfect, holy, and incorruptible God is going to create a creation that's perfect, holy, and incorruptible. That's the most reasonable and logical consequence we'd expect from him given the characteristics he's described as having. You can't say that God needs to allow evil in order to accomplish a greater good, because that would mean evil has a greater potential for creating good than God does. If God needs help to create the greatest possible good, then he ain't as perfect as Christians claim. And even if he did need help, he wouldn't turn to sin and evil to help him, even assuming that sin and evil had the power to create a greater good. But if sin and evil can do more to create good than God can on his own, that means that sin and evil is somehow good. And that's just nonsense, because according to Christians, they's the opposite of good. Next question, what does literally mean? In this specific context, it means believing that the magical stories in the Bible is reporting actual historical events and not some kind of metaphor or parable or such. I ain't going to let the believer get away with saying they knows the Bible uses figures of speech. Obviously it does, but that ain't the problem here. The problem is the supernatural stuff and whether or not it's supposed to be historically, literally factual. And that includes things like there being a solid firmament over the earth with doors in it that God opens to let the rain come down. Believers used to think that that was literally true, but believers today claim that's supposedly spiritual or metaphorical on account of we know now there ain't no such firmament up there. And it's worth pointing out that this is an example of making the Bible more true by taking it less literally. If in the less literal interpretation is more accurate in the cases we can verify, we ought to prefer it in the cases where we can't. Next up, how did science prove they ain't no God? Well, it didn't on account of this question's a straw man. Science don't prove things like the claim that they ain't no God. What science does is to give us a method we can use to examine the stories in the Bible, including the stories about supposed miracles, and see if they's consistent with what we actually find in verifiable objective reality. because truth means that which is consistent with objective reality. And science gives us a bunch of tools we can use to determine that. Finally, what's the difference between a human and a person? Well, obviously, this question is a gross straw man. Nobody's claiming that there's a difference between a human and a person. What is different is a fetus and a baby. In simple scientific terms, you can tell a baby from a fetus because a fetus has a placenta and a baby don't. And that's significant because without a placenta, it would drown and die inside the amniotic sac. Zygotes, embryos, and fetuses is all physically incomplete in a way that a baby is not. But all that is beside the point, because the real issue here ain't abstract philosophical debates about the beginning of personhood. The issue is forced pregnancy, which is a form of sexual assault that violates a woman's right to bodily autonomy. If in you's opposed to abortion, your only ethical alternative is to prevent unwanted pregnancies using birth control and comprehensive sex education. Forced pregnancy ain't a morally acceptable option, and those that's advocating it is sexual predators advocating the use of violence or threats of violence in order to seize control of someone else's genitals without their consent and use them in a way that degrades them and inflicts suffering, harm, and maybe even death. Oppose abortion all you want, as long as you don't use it as a pretext for imposing forced pregnancy on innocent folks. And you'll even find liberals and feminists supporting you in your drive to promote birth control and comprehensive sex education, because them's the only two ethical alternatives you got. Anyways, that's Greg's 5 examples and 5 possible responses in a nutshell. So moving on, we come to an interesting anachronism. It's kind of tangential, but I like the glimpse it gives us into the early church, so I was going to take a few minutes here. Quote, "When someone says to me, reincarnation was originally part of Christian teaching but was taken out of the Bible in the 4th century, I ask them to explain how that works. How does one remove select lines of text from tens of thousands of handwritten documents that had been circulating around the Mediterranean region for more than 300 years? End quote. Now, Greg's correct that the doctrine of reincarnation was not present in the texts that Christians today accept as the Protestant New Testament canon. But where he errs is in thinking that the Protestant New Testament canon even existed in the 300s CE, and in thinking that 4th century Christians regarded the Bible as the sole source of authority for Christian teachings. Obviously, Christianity and its teachings has been around for longer than the written texts we have today. And Protestants is the only folks that limit authoritative Christian teachings to the Bible. And even Protestants bundles in a heaping helping of extra biblical teachings in their interpretations of the scriptures. So even granted that reincarnation weren't ever in the original text of what we today call the New Testament, that don't mean that nobody in the early church believed in or taught reincarnation. A quick Google search turned up a paper describing early Platonists like Basilides, Valentinus, and Origen, who was Christian leaders in the early church. And the Platonists was so impressed by Plato that they wanted to incorporate his philosophy into Christianity so they could give God credit for it. And Plato did believe in reincarnation. Plato believed in a kind of salvation through gaining knowledge, and he figured it'd take more than one lifetime to learn as much as you needed to know, so to him that meant souls could be reincarnated as often as they needed in order to achieve salvation. And some of the early church fathers agreed, which kind of makes sense. I mean, if you failed to get saved in this life, maybe you could come back for another chance. Plus, it'd be a neat way to solve the problem of folks that died before the resurrection. Just reincarnate them back again, and then they can accept Jesus this time. Now, granted, Origen had some trouble with the idea and expressed some conflicting views, but Valentinus and Basilides did teach it, and it weren't permanently dead, pardon the expression, until the middle of the 6th century. So Greg's answer to his hypothetical interlocutor is both shallow and anachronistic. Reincarnation may not have been in the texts we have today, but it was taught by some in the early church. Greg goes on to present an example of what he calls a complex challenge. Quote, "Sometimes people claim that God is not necessary to explain morality because evolution can do the job. Since our survival depends on shared ethics, it's clear to see how natural selection working with the social contract could account for morality. No God needed. But this explanation hopelessly conflates two distinct notions. End quote. Notice what we might call tone of voice there in that last statement. The evolution of morality does involve the interaction of multiple factors, but Greg describes this interaction as quote-unquote hopelessly conflating what he calls quote-unquote two distinct ideas. Meanwhile, science frequently finds things in the real world that's the product of multiple distinct factors interacting, but by describing this particular interaction as hopelessly conflated, Greg manages to convey the idea that there's something improbable about it when they ain't. That's tone of voice, and that's a big part of how apologists manage to convince their audience without offering anything of any real substance. Anyways, the first so-called conflated factor that Greg mentions is, of course, Darwinian evolution, which he says, quote, by definition, it can explain morality only in terms of genetically determined physical traits selected for survival, end quote. And that's oversimplified to the point of being misleading. Evolutionary selection is a matter of differential reproductive success, not just survival. And folks is more likely to reproduce successfully in a society that's thriving than they is in one that's struggling. But in order for a society to thrive, it needs to figure out how everybody's going to get along with everybody else, and that's morality. So there's an interplay between social evolution and biological evolution. Biological evolution can contribute favorable traits like a tendency toward empathy and cooperation, and those traits can contribute to the social evolution of successful moral standards that enable the society to thrive. And when societies compete against one another, the more cohesive societies is going to have an advantage, which in turn is going to feed back into biological evolution through the thriving of the more cohesive society. Greg wants to claim that social evolution is something completely separate and independent from biological evolution. Quote, social evolution is the evolution of an intelligently designed social code that a civilization developed as it moved from a primitive nuclear stage, with each local group fending for itself, to a social contract stage, enabling all to live together in safety and harmony. End quote. And notice how he injected the idea of intelligent design in there as if some powerful and influential ruler had simply dictated what morality was going to be, and boom, suddenly folks magically all started getting along. Meanwhile, back in the real world, morality don't work that way and never has. Greg may be thinking of the story of Moses giving the Israelites the so-called Ten Commandments, but even if we was to assume that that story was historical, the whole rest of the Old Testament is the story of how folks continually broke them, especially the first two. Morality ain't something you can just issue a decree and suddenly everybody voluntarily cooperates. Morality is a social consensus that emerges spontaneously in a society as individuals each seek to maximize positive social interactions and minimize negative ones. It's kind of like the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Nobody intelligently guides how it's going to go. It just works itself out as individual participants looks out for their own best interests. And there's lots of folks that would just love to dictate how stock prices is going to go, just like Greg would love to dictate how morality works. But the reality is that it's going to go how it's going to go, and ain't nothing you can do about it. And if you's rich enough, you can temporarily influence the stock market in a certain direction, just like you might be able to temporarily pass laws mandating a particular concept of morality. But over the long term, it's going to do what it's going to do. And the same is true with morality. It ain't intelligently designed, it's an emergent social consensus based on what works best for the majority in terms of individual well-being and empathy for those around you. And that's something I think a lot of folks is about to discover the hard way. The American government is about to make a hard right turn into policies that's explicitly fascist, and they're going to try and legislate morality, and it ain't going to work. Like I said before, the mingling of church and state has never once failed to produce a deep and abiding corruption of both, and them that does the mingling inevitably ends up being labeled as not true Christians. And we're going to see that in America over the course of probably the next couple decades or so. History's going to repeat itself, and believers is going to fail to learn from it. But there's going to end up being a lot fewer believers on account of the corruption, making folks more likely to deconstruct their faith and find it wanting. But now I'm starting to preach and getting off the topic. The main point I want to emphasize here is that we need to deconstruct our own skepticism and understand precisely why we're skeptical and why we conclude that the Christian God is a myth. The more we know about Christian arguments and the flaws and fallacies behind them, the more prepared we'll be to defend ourselves when Columbo wannabes puts on their raincoats. And of course, anybody can get caught off guard and find themselves in a situation where they don't know or can't recall the best answers. It's perfectly fine in that situation to say, good question, let me get back to you on that. It's nice to have a good answer all ready to go, but if we don't, our best strategy is not to let ourselves be baited into following the apologist's little script. Just say, well, there's a thing or two I'd like to check up on before we continue this conversation, and then stop cooperating with the interrogation. It'll frustrate the would-be apologist, and frankly, that ain't a bad thing, because it might cause them to have a few doubts about whether the Columbo tactic is really all that effective, and that can only help. And I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we'll continue with Chapter 4 and see what other suspects Greg's going to want to try and interrogate, which I'm sure will be very educational, although probably not in the way that Greg expects. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.